Yes, I don't need these really.
Welcome everybody to our Wednesday study class that shall not be named, because after 11 years we haven't named it. We will one day though, but I like this name so far. We have people here from Sun City and from Hilton Head today, and we're looking forward to a wonderful study session. I'm going to begin again by reminding everyone that next week we'll be live in person and on Zoom at Karen Blickstein, and although he's not here, Stuart's home as well. And that his study session will start. We had a run through yesterday, and it'll start in 2 weeks. So that'll get publicity out for that on Zoom and YouTube. The NASDAQ is up, just in case you're wondering. I don't know why that just came up on my computer on the bottom, but it did. And so what we're going to do, because I'm not even sure what the NASDAQ is, I think it is the big racing circuit, right? That's what I think it is. So I think it's up, meaning like Jeff Gordon just won, because I guess that was a bad joke. Sorry. So
technology, is that what most of the stocks are?
I don't know. It just came up at the bottom of my thing. I'm not online, but just like where the part where it says mostly cloudy, it said NASDAQ up. So I don't know why that's there.
NASDAQ is the tech.
Yes.
That's what I said. Yeah. The stock index. Yeah.
All right. The place where I had all the stock before I had kids. So we're going to talk about one of the books of the Bible. I'm doing part of an Omer session with another group of rabbis. And so we're doing different books of the Bible. So we're going to look at the book of Daniel, which is a often overlooked book, even though ironically the name is very popular. The name Daniel, of course, has been a popular name in Judaism for a very long time. It predates the book of Daniel. We see it in places like Ezekiel. Obviously, Dan was one of the tribes, but the book of Daniel is a conundrum for a lot of ways. So we'll talk about what it is and why it's so unusual. And first of all, you have to understand the Bible itself. So there's 3 sections to the Bible. The first section is the Torah. The second section is prophets, which is the continuation of the Torah with the historical all the way to the destruction of the first temple, and then the actual books of the prophets. So that's the first 2 sections: Torah, prophets. The third section, writings, is throwing everything else in. So you have wisdom literature like Psalms and Proverbs. You have books that are connected to holidays and are part of what we call the Megillat, or the book of Esther. Then you have Chronicles, the last 2 books, which are basically a retelling of the story of David, kind of hiding all the bad stuff. And then finally you have the book of Daniel. That doesn't seem to fit anywhere. Is he a prophet? Is he wisdom literature? Is it a retelling of something? It's nothing, and it's not connected, although it has a lot of other things that connect it. So it is kind of a book unto itself. It's become probably most well known because of the chapter where Daniel goes into the lion's den. That's what everybody remembers. But it is really essential. First of all, maybe the last book written that made it into the Bible. And that is important because it kind of tells us when the last books were written. So this may have been written as late as the 2nd century BCE. What is the 2nd century BCE very famous for? The story of Hanukkah. So the books of the Maccabees were written probably at the end of the century. These books, the book of Daniel, was probably written during the time even of the story of the Maccabees. It could have been that late, because it actually, but not the end of the story, because it gets the end a little wrong. So it's probably written during the time of the rebellion, even like before the rebellion and during the rebellion, which is a really important thing for us to understand when we look at Daniel. Because Daniel is actually, if you have ever read it, 2 books really in one. So the first 6 chapters are about Daniel and his visions and his connections to the Babylonian and Persian kings. The second 6 chapters are kind of like this apocalyptic view of the world end of days, which is really the only place in the Bible where we see this idea of end of days, and possibly links to the idea that if you are a good person, you go to a good place. If you're a bad person, you don't. This is really the only book we really see that kind of thought really expressed. Now, people look at Isaiah and they kind of infer it or take it out, but really it is probably, that's more subject to debate as to opinion. Here we actually see this first time ever, this apocalyptic vision of an end of days possibility. And why is that so important? It helps us date it. Because this apocalyptic vision, or this vision of the next world, really come into play from around 200 BCE to 100 CE. So a 300-year period where you see has anybody seen The Life of Brian by any chance? Monty Python's The Life of Brian? Where he's like walking on the street and he's got like one messianic character after the other talking about the end of days. This is this period where this idea of the end of days is starting to happen. It really gets fruition during the Roman era, but it's starting here, and we're just starting to get the seeds of a vision of heaven that we have today, that there is a correlation between how you behave on this earth and what happens in the next world. So we see this in Daniel. Why? Because it's written so late. And if you're, some of the books are written 600-700 years earlier, maybe even 800 years earlier. So it's also written mostly in Aramaic and probably was originally all in Aramaic. So if it's in Aramaic, obviously this is the language that people are probably speaking and reading at this time period. So that helps also to date it, that most of it's in Aramaic, and even the Hebrew parts seem to be more translations possibly. So first of all, he cannot be classified as a prophet because he's not in the prophetic. What does a prophet do? A prophet mostly goes around and tells people what they're doing wrong. A prophet doesn't have a job, doesn't work for anybody. A prophet is outside the system. It means I can go up to the king and tell the king he is wrong. I can go to the priest and tell them they're wrong and tell everybody's wrong without worrying about what happens to me. Daniel has a job. He works for the kings. So therefore, i.e., he cannot be a prophet because he lives within the system. That's why he's not in the prophetic books. Also, the last official prophet was Malachi, who preached in the 5th century, where the story of Daniel is written in the 2nd century. However, even though it's written in the 2nd century, it occurs in the 6th century. So it actually occurs before the last prophet. So they could have put him into the book of prophets if they changed it a bit, because he does come before Malachi chronologically, but not when it was written. Does that make sense? It's written in the 2nd century, but it's about a guy living in the 6th century. So he's actually living before the last prophet. So he could be a prophet, but he's not a prophet. So that's important. That's why he's in this section. Now it has to do with visions. So it as what is the most famous character who is able to understand visions? It is Joseph. So it has some similarities to Joseph. Joseph ends up working for the Pharaoh of Egypt. Daniel ends up working for the emperor of Babylon and then Persia. And so it's because he can understand visions of the leaders. And then the second part of the book, he has his own visions, ironically, that he cannot understand. So he can't understand his own vision, so he has to ask the angels to help him, including the angel Gabriel, who we don't hear a lot about, but we hear about him here. So he can read other people's visions, but he has trouble reading his own visions. Now, He lives during the time period of the Babylonians and Persians. He names some of the kings, so it's a way of putting him into the history of the world. It's giving him a reality by putting him with actual kings. Now, when and what is going on? So in 587, Nebuchadnezzar, and the Babylonian Empire destroys the first temple, takes over Judah, and takes the Jews out of Judah into Babylon, where they become a community there. Did the Babylonians take all of the Jews? No. Probably just the prosperous and upper Jews. How do we know this? Because when Jews come back to Israel or Judah from Babylon, they have arguments and even fights with the Jews who've been living there for the last 50, 60, 70 years. So we know there were Jews who were left over. So he is living in Babylon during this period of exile. Probably he's a child probably when it happens, and he's probably a child from a wealthy family. It doesn't say exactly, but you can really hint that he is from a very nice family. He's educated. And so this is the period. Now, after the Babylonians destroy Judah, Cyrus, the king of the Persians, is going to take over the Babylonian Empire. And the Persians will then be in control of a large empire all the way to the time of the Greeks. Daniel is such a gifted individual that when the Babylonians are defeated and the Persians take over, he is able to keep his job and even get a better job. So this transcends. Why is that important? Because it's during this period after the Persians take over that Jews are allowed to go back to Israel. He is not one of them. It's not really mentioned that Jews are allowed to go back, but it is during that period where Jews can go back and start the temple again and so forth. So in many ways, it is historically accurate. Some kings are correct, but there are a lot of things that are not correct, especially things that happen. There's a prediction of a war in the 2nd century that doesn't happen. Some of the kings are a little off, but there's certainly a lot that shows that at least somebody knew something about this time period. And so any questions so far? All right, answer. So it's in the 3rd section in the writings. He's not a prophet. He's something altogether different. He's almost in his own classification. There's some links to Joseph because of the visions he's able to, but ironically, he can't understand his own visions. He has to ask for angelic assistance. He's from Judah, but living in Babylon from a well-established family. And so what we read is that the king of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, takes some boys to work in his office, basically. You know, promising kids that they'll come and educate them and they'll work for the king, possibly as kind of lower level people or to work with the Jews to help them acclimate, teach them the language of the land, that kind of stuff. And so specifically, they talk about 4 boys who were chosen, and one of them is Daniel, and they were the best of the best. And it talks about how, you know, they are superior to all the other Jews in every way. They're better magicians, they're better advisors, they have an understanding. So they really are the cream de la cream. And so they, in many ways, help show that the Jews are very worthwhile. And that helps to us understand that the Jews do very well in Babylon. When we go into exile in Babylon, we don't know exactly what happens except that we do well, that we do pretty well, probably because we were already literate at the time, at least the upper, even probably the lower echelon of Jews were literate. So this is piggybacking on that idea that you have these 4 boys who are 10 times better, it says, than the other men in his service, which doesn't necessarily mean you're going to rise to the top, because obviously it depends on if the king allows this new influx of people to rise to the top levels, or if it's just the aristocratic Babylonian families that can reach there. In this case, they do pretty well. And they're doing pretty well. And then we get into the story of the dreams. And of course, the king has a dream, and very similar to what happened to Pharaoh, nobody can predict him. And so Nebuchadnezzar has all of his whatever magicians or dream interpreters killed. And Daniel was kind of like a secondary one of these. So he was kind of be killed. He said, wait a minute, I haven't even had a chance to try to figure this out. Give me a chance before you kill me at least. And so obviously he was able to predict the dream. And the dream he predicted, just funny enough, said that Nebuchadnezzar will have a great empire, and that he will have his descendants will have monarchies for several generations. So what kind of emperor doesn't want to hear that, quite frankly? So he's smart enough to predict it that way. And so he is given a very high job in the Babylonian Empire. Obviously, there are no other records to corroborate this, or corroborate, however you say the word, this idea. But again, we're putting Jews into the larger world. Very, very similar to the Joseph story. He may have been even, it says he ran the empire, basically. You know, he's the guy who knows how to do the stuff. And so, of course, his 3 best buddies all become important, and he reciprocates for their support of him, and they now get jobs too. So they all have good jobs. And of course, jealousy arises from probably Babylonian executives. They're not going after Daniel. Daniel may be too high of a level to go after, but they go after his friends. And, it's all about, as usual, that, the very similar thing, that, they're not supportive enough. They don't pray the same way, something like that, probably. And so we all know they go into the furnace. So they're sent in the furnace to die. And what happens to them? They come out and their hair's not even cinched, and neither is their clothing. So they're proven to be fit. And of course, it's a miracle. So that probably only helps them to continue to have these, jobs. Then we continue with another dream where Nebuchadnezzar probably thinks he's a werewolf or something like that. And it's there's a writing on the wall, and he helps him through this madness, this crazy time period. And eventually the next leader takes over after Nebuchadnezzar dies. And there's another prophecy that's on the wall. And again, he is able to understand it. And so he becomes the high-ranking official for this next kingdom. So it's basically a continuation where he's doing so well that the next leader, and you imagine that can be some people, when there's a new administration, some people get the axe, and then some people get to stay on, and he got to stay on and even get a higher job, possibly by the leader named Belshazzar. So now he predicts that Belshazzar's kingdom is going to be taken over by the Persians. And before Belshazzar can get upset at him for this prediction, he dies that night. And of course, the Persians take over, and guess who gets to stay on? And his job is Darius. I mean, Daniel, who stays under the Persians, the Medes, under Darius. And then what happens? Again, the same thing. Jealousy pervades, and he is thrown into the lion's den. This is where he's thrown in by jealous. Basically, it's a very similar case to what's done in other places. Other officials create laws that Jews can't pray 3 times a day, and they create laws that they know he cannot follow. And so, like, can't sacrifice to another god besides their gods. And so he is unable to follow this, and he goes to the lion's den. And the king is so upset about this because it kind of was done behind his back, that after the next day he goes in, the king is crying, and all of a sudden, who comes out of the lion's den without a mark on him? Daniel. He's fine. Unfortunately, the people who denounce Daniel are then thrown into the lion's den, and they don't have the same luck. So they're eaten. So before you denounce somebody, make sure that that person will get eaten by lions. He was probably some sort of lion tamer. Daniel worked in a circus, maybe. I don't know. But that becomes the most famous part of the story, is the lion's den. That, and so he doesn't fight the lion. He's not a warrior like Samson, but he survives. And so that's kind of the end of the narrative. It's in first person, it's in third person. The next 6 chapters will be first person Daniel talking about his visions. And it's really interesting because the visions are apocalyptic at times. They are connected to angels who come in to help him understand his vision. It's written in Aramaic, so there is a very firm belief that the first 6 chapters were written by Daniel A, and the second 6 chapters were written by Daniel's B. There may be 4 of them, they believe. So there could be up to 5 different writers of the book of Daniel, plus the fact that they believe the Hebrew had been translated from the Aramaic. And so he goes into this idea of the world eventually being ruled by the people, by the saints of the Most High. Kind of like the first steps to this idea of end of days. Hints to that. He also talks about visions for the future that go all the way to future empires, way in the future, way, way in the future. How far in the future? Way in the future, if that's not specific enough. So he talks about 4 kingdoms that will be in the future. He actually mentions it earlier, but in chapter. So we're talking about possibly the Babylonians, the Persians, and maybe the Medes, and then the Greeks. And of course, that goes all the way to the 2nd century, because he also references kind of probably the Assyrian Greeks. So, but there's different ways to look at the 4, but most people think it's the Babylonians, the Medes, which are kind of connected to the Persians and the Greeks. And so all the way to the Hellenistic era, which of course is the Greek era, when this apocalyptic belief system starts to really take hold a little bit. So it's really interesting that he's able to look that far into the future. Of course, if you believe it's being written in the 2nd century during the reign of Antiochus, then it's not so hard to see the future because you've already seen it. So, it talks a little bit about this, eschatological idea of that angels will triumph in the end. The little horn will be the big horn, basically. And so, any questions, by the way? And by the way, his name means kind of judge of God. So that's another way. But he's not a judge akin to like the books of Judges or to an actual judge. So it talks a little bit about in the visions how the Persian, this allusions probably to the Persians going to war with the Greeks and losing. Talks about how the Greek Empire may be divided up. It talks about a great deal about these visions he will have. And it's really a very different genre than what we really have seen up to this point. You have to remember, the Bible, especially the early part, is set in many ways on the really unique idea that God wants us to behave. And if we behave, we'll be rewarded. And if we misbehave, we'll be punished. There are consequences to our actions. This is kind of the theme of the entire Bible. However, by the time you get to books like Job, which is also kind of a book on its own, we see that people are not really supporting or enthralled with the idea that the way you act will determine what you receive, because they're so easy to disprove. As we've talked about, I see Larry is an awful person. I see Ron is a great person. Larry is healthy, has money, has a wonderful wife, and Ron has boils and is in pain all the time and doesn't have any money, and people like Larry. Ron has no friends. But Ron is really a nice guy, and Larry is really not. It can be very obvious. We've all seen it. We've all seen in the news or in reality terrible people who are succeeding brilliantly and wonderful people who are suffering terribly. So this vision of a world where you're rewarded starts to fade. It's essential for Judaism to have it, because nobody had ever had the idea that God's want us to behave and that God's will reward us according to our behavior. God's traditionally rewarded people for doing things for them. You're rewarded for your behavior if your behavior helped the God. Our God says, no, I want you to be an ethical person. So as time goes on, this belief starts to dissipate, and books like Job help bring it to the forefront. And then books like Daniel take it close to the next step, not quite there. And the next step, of course, is, well, maybe we're not rewarded in this world, we're rewarded in the next world. His is more concentrating more on these apocalyptic visions of kind of a precursor, the end of days viewpoint. But you get that feeling that maybe there is a hint that we will start to believe this idea that rewards come in the next world. So it's really interesting to see that Job and Daniel, probably more than any other books, are the transitional books to the next stage of Judaism. They're really the transitions out of the Bible into this new belief system that's going to be headed up by the proto-rabbis, the Pharisees. And it's really a beautiful way of changing it, because the whole idea of Judaism could have ended because of this reality that good things happen to bad people and bad things happen to good people. But yet Daniel and Job help take it to the next level. And so even though the history in it is not always accurate, there's a lot that is. It's great to see that we are putting ourselves into a larger world. The first time you really see this way of putting ourselves into the larger world is when chapter 14 of Genesis, where Abraham is put into a war of the 9 kings. And so he is put into this war and is made the hero of this war. Now, this war we do not know about today. It's not a famous war, but at the time it probably was a famous war. And they wanted to put Abraham into it to give Abraham more credibility. Abraham worked with these 4 kings that defeated these 5 kings, and Abraham was the hero. It's kind of like saying, putting a Jewish person into World War II and making him the best pilot hero of World War II. And so this is what we see with the book of Daniel, is they're putting Daniel into the story with all of these kings that people know about. Larry. And I don't know why you're not on mute, but I can't hear you. I don't know what is. Might check your go to your mute and check your. You can check. Try again. Now you're on mute. If you go to the mute thing and go upward, that little up arrow, and go to audio settings, or go to test speaker and microphone. All right, we'll come back to you. So if you can figure out, sorry about that. And Karen, Karen, are you saying something?
I was going to tell Larry, I'm sorry, yeah, I was muted. Put it, yeah, Larry could put it in chat.
Yeah, put it in chat, Larry, if you want. You can tap it in type it into chat.
Yeah.
All right, so putting Daniel into this history, kind of like Joseph was put into the history by being the number 1 person to Pharaoh, gives him more credibility. I mean, this is the guy, the number 1 guy for, now they can't put Daniel officially as the leader of the empire because everybody already knows who the leader is. That's Samuel Gelman, Rabbi Gelman. And Saturday is Jessica and Mac, I believe. And if you go to that list, excuse me, guys, 1 second, I'll send you the list again because somehow it got erased. I put it all on there, but it all got erased off in May, but it didn't get erased. Sorry, guys, we had a little thing. It didn't get erased off for June, so some reason. So I'll send it to you right now.
Thank you. Appreciate
Yeah, sorry. Sorry, guys, we're getting stuff going. That was Katie, who was awesome, doing good stuff. Let me just make sure something real quick. Let's see here. I'll find it. Oh, there you go. All right, there you go. All right, any questions so far? I'm answering all the questions. Except for Larry's. Let's see. Okay, put anything in chat yet? Not yet. Okay. So now Daniel himself again can't be put as the leader of the empire. Why? Because everybody knows the names of the leaders. So you put the person as far as you can. You can't make Joseph Pharaoh because everybody knows that their Pharaoh is an Egyptian, and everybody knows there hasn't been a Jewish Pharaoh. And you can't put Daniel as the leader of a country where you know the name of the other leader. Daniel prophesizes, but not in the book of Prophets. Exactly. So that's Larry's. Daniel prophesizes, but not in the book of Prophets. That's a good point. There is more to prophets than just prophecy. And the prophets are ethical prophets. So in order to be a prophet, it is not just about visions of the future. It is about trying to create an environment where people are acting according to what they're supposed to do. So the prophets that we speak of in the books of prophets are the ones who walk around the countryside going to king, to people, to priests, to everybody and saying, you are misbehaving, you need to behave. If you don't behave, this is going to happen. That's the prophets we're talking about. That's Isaiah and Ezekiel and Jeremiah and Jonah and Haggai. That's their job. So it's not just about visions, it's about extorting the people to behave. Daniel doesn't do this, one. And number two, the prophet has to be someone who is outside the system, as I mentioned earlier. a prophet can't have a job, because if you have a job, that means somebody can fire you. If you have a job, that means you may give your boss a break, or you may prophesize against your boss's competitor. The prophet is not allowed to have these connections. The prophet has to be completely unbiased and look at everybody from an outside perspective and say you are misbehaving or not. You can't have like my connection to my children. I love my children. Am I going to prophesize against my children? Probably not. Even if I do, I'm not going to say it out loud. So I'm not going to tell the king that he's doing a terrible job if I work for the king, or if I'm going to be killed for saying this. A prophet has no such restrictions. The prophet can go to the king, knowing the king might kill him, and say, you're doing a terrible job. You need to stop doing this. He'll say it loud and far to everybody, not embarrassed to do so, without fear or constraint. And that is what the prophet. Daniel is not like this. Daniel works for somebody. And Daniel's trying to show his boss that he's good at his job so he can keep his job and presumably help the Jewish people and be a good representative of the Jewish people, even though it doesn't go into that. But we know the Jews during the Persian era are allowed to go back to Judah if we want. We know the Jews during the Babylonian era are treated very well, considerably well, especially considering they rebelled and fought a war against them. So they are now giving us the opportunity to infer that the Jewish people are doing well in these instances because of people like Daniel, who are proving their worth. You know, it's like people moving to your country. You know, if I want to move to Australia, I can't go to Australia unless I have something they need. I can visit, but I can't move there unless I'm going to study, so I'm paying tuition, or I have a job they need. If I'm a nurse, I can move to Australia probably. If I'm a rabbi, maybe. If I'm a doctor, maybe. I'm an engineer. I mean, if you have a skill that they want, then they let you in. And that's what Daniel's trying to prove, that the Jewish community has skills and they should be treated fairly and well. And obviously he does a great job, because every time he's denounced or his friends are denounced, God intervenes. So that can only help. So it also shows that in the 2nd century, people were familiar with the Bible and they were familiar with previous stories. Because sometimes you think these things are written in a vacuum and the rabbis then just gather them all up. Whoever wrote the story of Daniel knows about the history of the world and knows about the destruction of the temple and the Jews living in Persia and Babylon, and knows what's going on to the Jews living that age. And remember, we're talking about somebody in the 2nd century writing about people in the 6th century, in an age where they didn't have computers, in an age where there was writing and people could read and write, but not like today. So obviously this history was pretty well known, or these people were educated, and they were trying to create this apocalyptic era by hearkening back. In other words, how do you make somebody more important? You put them in history in a more important time. So, the farther back you go, the more important somebody is, the more important somebody was in his time. So this is Daniel, who was the number 2 guy during the time of Nebuchadnezzar and Cyrus, going from one empire to the next. And he said that there's going to be, and then he predicts all these things correctly. And then he talks about the apocalyptic vision. That's really the main thing they're trying to probably get around, is like this idea of the end of days. But in order to say the end of days may happen, it's better to go back and have somebody really famous talk about it. Like, is it better? Am I going to get more publicity if I talk about this issue, or if I get the governor to talk about it, or if I get, some founder of a major company that everybody knows, or if I go back and say Albert Einstein said, that's a lot more potent than if I say something. So if I can put something into Albert Einstein's mouth, that's going to have a lot more credence. And that's what they're doing. They're saying this guy way back 400 years ago said this is going to happen. Now, did his prophecies come true? In the first, he's able to read the visions correctly. Did his prophecies come true? A lot of them did. Some of them did not. So prophecies that happened possibly after the writers lived did not come true. Like there was a vision of a very big war between two empires that never came to fruition. Some of the kings are not correct, but overall, yes, there was a lot that did come true. Now, the ideas of the end of days obviously did not, because they gave a certain amount of time, 2009, so a few years, it'll happen. That didn't happen, but you can always find ways to push that back. Like whenever apocalyptic cult says, this is the year it all ends, and when it doesn't happen, I misread the signs, or the signs are saying we got a continuance. We got a chance for 5 more years, but it's still going to happen if we don't do this. So some of it does and some does not. But again, if you want more like the narrative, it's the first 6 chapters. If you want the prophecies, that's the second 6 chapters. But again, what we see is this apocalyptic vision of the end of days doesn't really become the major part of Judaism, mostly because it's such a late installment in our religion. But this idea of the next world and apocalyptic days, what religion does it become more a part of than ours?
Christianity.
Christianity, exactly.
No?
When is Christianity founded? It's founded during this 300-year window where the end of days in heaven is really taking form. So when Christianity is founded, the idea of heaven is already starting to take shape, and the idea of end of days. So it is created into the foundations of Christianity, where in Judaism, it's a much later addition. So the best way I use to explain this, it's like learning a language. If you learn the language from birth, obviously you're going to be more fluent than someone who learns it at age 75. You can still learn a language at 50 or 75, but you're never going to be as fluent as if it's your first language. And for Christianity, end of days and heaven are part of their first language. I mean, it's one of the original ideas, where in Judaism it is a really late idea. I mean, we've been around more than 1,000 years before this idea really starts to come into it. So as you can imagine, and 2,000 years later, it's still obvious. Who talks more about end of days or heaven, Jews or Christians? Christians a lot more. And that's because it's now, in fact, there are a lot of Jews who don't even know that Jews believe in heaven. Christians don't even know if Jews believe in heaven, because we don't talk about it. Our religion is so focused on today. Be good today and you'll be rewarded, and worry about the other stuff later. The heaven stuff comes later. So it's not an afterthought, but it's a secondary thought. So when I preach, I preach about being a good person today, where in Christianity, they'll talk a lot more about going to heaven and that kind of stuff. It's not better or worse. It's just different. Even though we both believe in heaven, and there are Jews who believe in end of days, and there are Christians who believe in end of days, it is much more prominent in that world. And that's probably one of the reasons. So Daniel really is the book that sets all of this up for us. It's a really interesting book. It's really easy to read. It harkens back again. You see connections to Jeremiah, so whoever writes it. So they try and make sure that Daniel has this, that he is prominent enough that since it comes from him, now you see some very specific things in it that help you realize where it's written. Like it very specifically kind of writes about the destruction of the Greek Empire and how that's going to be divided into different empires, and they're going to be different ones that control this land, which is exactly what happens, because obviously if you believe it's written during that period, they know what happens. So that's pretty accurate. But there are some other things. Some of the history is not as accurate, and the future is not as accurate. So that's the book of Daniel, which is pretty cool. Thank you for letting me practice. I don't think I have to figure out how to do like 20 minutes of just that first part because I'm working with somebody else. So we'll see how that works. Now for next week, we're going to be studying again history of the Jewish movements, which I take to mean the Reform movement, the Conservative movement, Orthodox and Reconstructionist movement. Now, Larry asked, does end of days refer more to this total destruction of the world, or the end of the days for each of us? The end of days is the end of the world as we know it, but not necessarily the destruction of the world. It's a belief that the next world and this world will be mixed together, and that peace will reign and we'll be connected to our ancestors, who some will believe in the resurrection of the body, and that all will be at peace. So it's not like the destruction where we all die, or it could be where we all die and we're united in heaven together. But so that's what it is. As long as I have access to Netflix and Disney, I'll be okay.
Does that relate to Mashiach? I mean,
It
do
does.
you need one to the other,
And that does. We're not quite there yet in Daniel, though. We haven't got to the idea that there's going to be David's descendant is going to be the Messiah. So that's going to be coming a little bit later. Now, you will see people take passages from Isaiah especially and make it seem like it says in the Bible the Messiah is coming from the line of David. That is really up to you to decide if it's that's something that really happens or something you're inferring. So, but it doesn't get quite to that point here. That's going to really come after the Bible closes. So it really, in the time of Daniel, when it's written, we're just starting this time period of the apocalyptic literature. It's really going to get going during the Roman times. When times get really bad for the Jews, that's where it really starts to hit home. And so this is the very beginning of it. So you can definitely get a feeling of it. So everybody okay? Is anybody going on vacation? I just went to Cuba. If anyone wants to know, it's a really interesting place to go and really easy to get into and out of. So it's a myth that you can't go anymore. You really can. So looking forward to next week and food and getting to talk to people in person. Can you imagine that? That's going to be awesome. I'm going to remind everybody that a week from Monday, that at noon, Larry's going to have his Munch and Mole
Not Larry.
lunch discussion. Huh?
Not Larry.
No, Larry, Stuart, sorry.
He's not even here.
Stuart. I'm getting so tired and confused. Stuart's going to have his Munch and Mole. We're going to do it that one day. We're going to skip Memorial Day, and then we're going to do all of June. He's going to be talking about ethics. So really going to be interesting. You can watch on Zoom or on YouTube. So that'll be coming out. So make sure to check for that. Any other thoughts or questions? And next week, again, we're going to talk about the movement. So that'll be fun.
Karen, you're going to send the email out.
I will. I'll do that right after. Yeah, today.
And also, it's Mother's Day service this Saturday.
Okay. Would you add, I don't know if you have her information, Mona Griffer? I don't,
She's not on the list? Okay, I don't think she's on the list.
no,
right
she's
away.
not, but she wants to be. She called me yesterday.
Okay, and I did not put on
Heard
it.
about what we're doing next week and wants to come.
All right, so I'll put her on the list.
Do you have her information?
I do. So
Okay, good.
I'll put it right now.
And I'm going to use your list to.
I'll send you the updated one
Okay,
right now, right after this. I'll send it.
okay. And then I'll send something out right after
Okay,
that.
perfect.
If anybody, let me know if you're coming, if you need a guest. Anyway, I'll put all that in.
Lou, are you on that list also? Let me see if Lou's on the list also. Lou, you are not on that one, so I'm gonna put you on that one, okay, if you want, if that's okay.
Thank you.
Okay, and I have it in a Word document, so it's not the best format, but it makes it easy for me. Okay, thank you guys, and I hope everyone has a wonderful, wonderful week. And again, for those of you who are celebrating, I hope you have a wonderful Mother's Day. It's always nice. We will have a service here. The women of McVisril will be leading it. I mean, I'll be kind of directing, but they're going to be doing all the parts. And then Israel update. Oh, Gaza strikes. That's something we can talk about too later. I'm not up to date with what happened today yet, but we know that the strikes were in Gaza. They were waiting for reprisals.
Have the news on yet?
The other news, of course, is that, the political news, which is for those of us who are, nervous about it in Israel, that they're doubling, tripling, and quadrupling all the money now going to the ultra-Orthodox. So,
Right.
not surprising, but unfortunate. So, but I don't live there, so my taxes don't go to them. So,
Crazy.
when you got political power, you can make sure that you get all the money, even though you do not participate in the economy. It's kind of strange, but that's every place has their goods and bads. Okay, Lou, I'm putting you on this list as well.
Thank you.
Sorry I didn't do it earlier. Apologize. And then, all right. So everyone have a great one.
Thank you.
Look forward to seeing you
Yeah.
next week.
Yep.
Thank you.
Hey,
We'll see you
stay healthy
Saturday,
and
Rabbi.
safe.
Yes, it'll be a wonderful service Saturday. And thanks again, everybody. Have a good one.
Thanks.
Bye,
Thank you.
everybody.
Bye, everybody. Larry, before you go, are you in South Carolina or what? Are you in South Carolina? Okay, good. All right.
Oh, good. Welcome back.